Okay, Dr. Marquardt. Can you please give me an intro on the Calusa people? What do you think would be a good intro for somebody who isn't familiar with them and would you would want them to be captivated by these people?
Well, a lot of people don't know that all of South Florida was once the domain of the Calusa Indians. If you were to draw a line between, say, Bradenton and Fort Pierce, everything south of there was uh, dominated by this one group of people who lived on the southwest coast near Fort Myers. They were powerful. They traded widely with other people. They were very accomplished. And according to the Spaniards, they controlled and drew tribute or taxation from people all over South Florida, including as far as Miami, Florida Keys, Lake Okeechobee. So they were a very accomplished tribe. One of the things that is interesting about them and why uh, people like me, archaeologists and anthropologists, are interested in them is that they became very rich and powerful, uh, but they weren't an agricultural group. They were fishing people. And they made their living by being very good at fishing. That included net fishing, weirs, traps. Uh, they were able to feed large populations and learn to fish very effectively. And this led to uh, a, uh, a strong and viable culture that lasted for a long time.
Yes. Actually, how long did they last exactly?
Well, they certainly were well established when the Spaniards arrived, and archaeologists can trace them back at least 1,000 years in that very area in Southwest Florida. Um, some people think they were there even earlier than that, but I feel very certain that by 500 A.D. or so, the same people lived in the area uh, that the Spaniards found them in 1513.
When I first came across the Calusa, uh, it was because when I was walking around in Marco Island on Tiger Tail Beach, I stepped on a seashell and it pierced through my foot. And when I started kind of looking up online, why was there so many seashells on that beach? Like, why did I? That's never happened to me. Like, what is that about? I started to see websites saying something about the Shell Indians. And so I clicked on it and then I came across the Calusa. So why were the Calusa called the Shell Indians in particularly?
Because shellfish were very important to the Calusa for a number of reasons. For one thing, they ate a lot of shellfish, as many of us do today, and really relish various kinds of shellfish. But they also used some of the more robust shells for cutting tools, for uh, hammers, for axes, various things that they used, and even sometimes used them for drinking vessels. And so shells were very important to them for a lot of reasons. Uh, they did eat shellfish, but that wasn't their main dietary staple. They were mainly a fishing people.
Right, right. Yeah, that's what I saw on the internet. There was a huge emphasis on fishing in their community, which
Yeah.
made them stand out for me as well. And when it comes to environmental stewardship. So currently around the world, indigenous tribes, a lot of them are regarded as environmental stewards. Did the Calusa civilization have their own version of environmental stewardship?
If by stewardship you mean that they lasted a long time and were successful, then absolutely they were. Uh, it's impossible to know how they thought about the environment spiritually or whatever, but when people over a long period of time develop skills and are able to adapt to changes and to take advantage of opportunities, then they will last a long time and they'll have experiences that will be passed down from generation to generation. And that happens around the world, not just for the Calusa, but indigenous people who have survived and lived in a region for a long time have figured out what to do and what works and what wasn't work. Now, if the environment stayed the same all the time, and we could get up every day and say, "Oh, it's just like it was yesterday," and I'll just do the same thing and I'll either succeed or I'll even do better, well, that would be all right. But that's not the way it is. The environment is changing all the time, and there's short-term changes, weather changes, there's long-term climate changes, and in our time we even see global climate changes. It's very distressing. But when the environment always provides challenges from time to time, but it also provides opportunities from time to time. And so if you can take advantage of the opportunities and be able to react positively to the challenges, then your society is going to last a long time. And so that's the way the Calusa did it. If that's stewardship, then they were environmental stewards.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. Maybe this might be the same question. So does studying how the Calusa adapted and thrived in their coastal environments through their own practices give contemporary society tools and ideas on how to combat climate change and maybe conserve the natural environment in South Florida and Southwest Florida?
I think anytime you can learn from the past, it helps us in the future. The Calusa technology was not the same as ours, and we have a tendency in our society, in our time, to imagine that technology will solve our problems for us, and that we just need to depend on someone to tell us what to do, and everything will be okay. I think that's probably a misguided feeling. And the more we can learn about how things have changed in the past and how people took advantage of the opportunities and reacted to the challenges, then the better off we'll be. In archaeological sites, it's not just the artifacts that we find, it's the bones and the plant remains and the shellfish that we find that can be analyzed, and we can actually see how climate has changed, how people adapted to different processes and things that were happening to them. So there's a lot in archaeology that can help us understand how short-term and long-term climate changes have affected people and how they've responded. And it's not just about the Calusa. If we can learn more about how indigenous people everywhere in our own area, wherever we live, indigenous people have reacted to these challenges and opportunities, and we'll be better equipped to make some of those decisions better for ourselves.
Yeah. So that kind of answers why the past is important to understand the present and the future.
Well, I think so. I'm biased. I'm an archaeologist, but yes, I think so. I think, yeah, understanding the past is always important to being able to cope in the future.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, so we talked about environmental stewardship and you gave me a good answer on that. And so I guess I just got curious about whether, learning about the past, learning about the Calusa, like as a civilization is important for today, for the present and the future. Like why would it be important for those timelines?
Well, archaeologists don't just look at artifacts. We are able to find out quite a bit about how cultures, not just how cultures have changed, but how the environment has changed, both short-term changes and longer-term changes like global cooling, global warming, times of dryness and otherwise. So by studying the plant remains, shellfish remains, fish remains, we can actually track some of those things pretty reliably. Those things tell us about how the Calusa responded. They tell us about times of opportunity, they tell us about times of challenge, and then we can see at a fairly reasonable level how the Calusa responded to those challenges and opportunities. This is a lesson we can learn from indigenous societies throughout the world, as they have done the same thing the Calusa have. They have lived in an area so long and made mistakes and corrected those mistakes and responded to challenges and opportunities over a long time. And that has resulted in there being viable cultures. If you then come in from the outside, look at an environment and say, we're going to apply something here that has worked other places, so it'll probably work here too. That's not necessarily taking advantage of the local knowledge. So the more we can learn about how indigenous people in any region have operated in the past, how they've been able to succeed and overcome various challenges, the better it is for planning today. It's what we call historical ecology. It's the notion that people react to the environment reacts to them, depending on what you're doing, what techniques and strategies you apply. And so that kind of informs our understanding of indigenous cultures and how they have coped over the time. We call it historical ecology.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I think that I've been trying to find like the name or the area that I'm interested in when it comes to indigenous peoples, and I think that helps me. I think it's kind of hard to start sometimes because I feel like I haven't really been taught much about indigenous people, so I think that that's a good way to kind of a good term to look up online and start looking myself. And then while I find
try historical ecology, and there are case studies. There's some great case studies out there of how people have listened to local people about how to operate and made better decisions about things in the long run. I can send you some references to those things.
Yes, please. Thank you. So in regard to Calusa society and community, I was really interested in Calusa community because I guess I didn't see much on my research on Google, on my Google research. I didn't see much of like their interactions, how how they interacted as a community, as a society. So could you give me some insights into that? Kind of like, yeah, could you give me some info on that? Maybe the most fascinating details of that point of view.
All human beings organize themselves in certain ways, and most indigenous societies are based on balance. That's a broad generalization, but what I mean by that is that there are roles for older people, roles for younger people. There are things that women do, there are things that men do. There are things that women own that men don't own, and so forth. And so the idea of many indigenous cultures, including many North American, Native American cultures, is that there's a balance, a counterbalance between males, females, older, younger. Older people are the knowledge carriers, and younger people learn from them. And sometimes, women hold power in certain ways, men hold power in other ways. They're not the same power, but you need both in order to be able to function as a society. As for the Calusa, we don't know a whole lot about how they organized themselves or how they thought about all that. We know that women, for example, had positions of power. That in some of the historical accounts, we know that women did not hesitate to speak their mind to the Spaniards about things. And we know that there have been female chiefs of the Calusa from time to time. But we don't really know the details about the relationships between males and females, old and young, and for the Calusa. In societies where anthropologists have been able to talk to people who are living people, a little bit more is known about that sort of thing. I would also say that the Calusa traded widely with other people. They were aware of not just other people in Florida, but they traded with people as far away as the greater southeastern United States. Some of the shells that the Calusa traded, the large whelk shells that were used for drinking vessels, those things are found all the way as far as Manitoba, Canada, and Oklahoma and New York. So either by indirect trade or going there themselves with things, they really got around. We also know that they had a strong military, at least at the time the Spaniards arrived. They were said to be at war with the Tocobaga, who lived in the Tampa Bay area, today's Tampa Bay area. And so there were special roles in warfare, special roles in trade, in diplomacy, and of course, the backbone of the culture was fishing. And I would imagine everybody had to participate one way or another in that, either in a supervisory capacity or mostly as working people. If you depend on nets, and these are nets that were formed by weaving palm fibers into cordage and putting the cordage together into nets. If nets are the foundation of your subsistence, your daily bread, if you will, then you got to keep making them and repairing them and deploying them and working around the clock to get those things done, rather than working with getting up at a certain time of the day and going to work. Your day was more organized around the tides and the phases of the moon and when the fish were moving and when they were spawning and what was going on. So there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that gets passed on from elders to younger people. And I would imagine that's the way the communities were organized. We have to do a certain amount of speculating about this, but the fact that they survived for so long without having any agriculture, other than maybe a few home gardens where they raised a few little things, but no corn, no manioc. They were a fishing people, and they were able to not just get by, but to thrive for hundreds of years with a fishing subsistence base.
I was wondering if the Calusa had some sort of methods of storytelling, but maybe that's not known.
Yeah, everybody has stories. Everybody has music. Everybody has dances. I'm sure they had all those things, and the Spaniards tell us about some things that they did. They had synchronized singing by hundreds of young women, for example, when they were visited by Menendez in 1566. They were masked processions, religious processions, you would think, of masked priests with women singing alongside the procession. They probably had drums, and they certainly must have had dances. But in a society that doesn't write things down, then knowledge has to be passed down from elders to youngers. That's the way it is in many societies today, and where you expect to gain experience from listening to people who have experience, and then you go out and try things, and you get guidance from those people who are older. One learns from one's contemporaries as well, and tries new things, but there is a basic stock of knowledge there about what works and what doesn't work, and that gets passed down. It can be passed down in stories and kind of allegories of life, how things work. Many Aboriginal societies today do exactly that. Elders sit in one side of the structure, and younger people sit on the other side of the structure, and they listen to the older people tell stories. What those stories were for the Calusa, I have no way of knowing. But life lessons and experiences are passed down to younger people by older people in all indigenous societies that I can imagine. Pedro Menendez Daviles in 1566 tried to make an alliance with the king of the Calusa. He visited the site called Mound Key. Today it was called Kalos then. And so each group was trying to impress the other, if you will, like any diplomatic setting. So Menendez came with his entourage of people. He had a singer with him. He had everybody's all dressed up, and the Calusa had all their finery on. They had people inside. They met in a building that was large enough for 2,000 people to stand inside. a building built by the Calusa on Mount Key. And the records say that as the Calusa were meeting with the Spaniards inside, that there were 500 Indian girls outside singing. Apparently it was in some sort of organized way, so like a call and response maybe, or something in which they were remarkably singing synchronized songs outside. And there were 500 girls doing that. So, this is saying that at the very least they had an appreciation of music, and it was a special thing. They really wanted to welcome the Spaniards, but they also wanted to make a deal with them, and have an understanding about how they could help each other. None of that worked, by the way, but we know a little bit about that meeting and some of the things that went on there.
Yeah. So when was that? Like, that sounds really like a specific time period. I don't think we've gotten there. So when exactly was that recorded? Like when in the history?
February of 1566. That's when Menendez came to visit Carlos to try to make an alliance with him, so that the Calusa could help the Spaniards and the Spaniards could help the Calusa.
Okay.
It ultimately did not work out.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of information about that meeting. But imagine, a building large enough for 2,000 people to stand inside. That's pretty big even by today's standards.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't go to the hardware store and buy pre-cut lumber. This is, trees holding things up, and a lot of thatch, and the trees had to be brought from elsewhere. The pine trees, the posts. This is those things don't grow on Mount Key. It's not a pine tree island. It's an island in the middle of the Estero Bay. So there's for everything that we learn about in a Spanish document or whatever, there's all these other things that are implied. Like, okay, somebody had to build that building. Somebody had to direct the building of that building. We observe a canal on Pine Island, for example. It's 2.5 miles long, and it's straight and goes all the way across the island, 6 to 8 feet deep. That had to be built and it had to be maintained, and somebody had to understand the hydrology and the engineering to be able to create that. There are fish traps at Mount Key, capital of the Calusa, that held up to 6,000 square meters of water, which would have trapped fish and then stored fish to feed a large population, perhaps 1,000 people living on Mount Key at one time. These are engineering skills, and that required not just materials and transport, but direction, and somebody had to understand how all these things worked, and to supervise and say, okay, well, this needs to be done next, and that's so there's a tremendous amount that you can learn by just observing the archaeology, because we can find the remains of that house. We know where it was, and we have the Spanish documents to tell us how big it was and what went on there. So little by little by little, you put it all together, and you get a picture of a society that was pretty well accomplished in a lot of different ways, and very powerful, and lasted a long time. So yeah, that's what's interesting to me.
No, yeah, me too. I didn't know about the waterway you were speaking of, right? Like where they had to engineer the fish, what was it, the water courts, right?
Water courts, the canals, the water courts,
wow.
the structures.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating, because I didn't think that far into. That's right. Calusa also had engineers. They had to be, their version of engineers. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So you say, well, what were they like? Well, they were like us in some ways. We have diplomats. They had diplomats. They had traders. We have traders. We have engineers, they had engineers. We have religious specialists, they had religious specialists. We have an army, they had an army. It's just, it's different, but it's they're just people just like us. They're as smart as we are
Yeah.
today, and people have been as smart as we are today for a long, long time, long before the Calusa. So you just have
Yeah.
to think of them as people, and solving problems. They just did it in a way that was appropriate for their environment, and they responded to challenges and opportunities, and managed to survive
Yeah,
and prosper,
yeah, that's
survive and
comforting.
prosper.
That's comforting because then you think of the future, and since we have survived for so long and have known how to do things for so long, then there's hope for the future that we can do that as well, and, and
One
perhaps
hopes
even
so.
better.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So we spoke about kind of like what they do creatively. I know that they also you said they did pottery, right, as well.
They made a kind of a utilitarian pottery, which by some people's standards is not very attractive. Their artistic expression was more likely in carving wood and painting. They had amazing paintings were discovered at the uh, Marco Island site, same place where you cut your foot, that island. There was a site there that was excavated in 1896 by Frank Cushing, and there were still painted masks and uh, beautifully carved wood that was done by somebody. There were also bone carvings that are very exquisite. So although their pottery was kind of mundane, they expressed themselves in wood carving, bone carving, and painting.
Yeah, and then and then also that synchronization of singing as well, maybe like I thought when you said it, it kind of sounded like a choir to me. Was it like a choir or no?
They did a what now? Sorry.
Yeah, like the synchronized singing sounds like choir
Yeah,
almost.
like a choir. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. I think that's another way of saying it. It was, in other words, they weren't just kind of out there chanting or something. There were songs that were organized, and
Yeah.
apparently the Spaniards were quite impressed. And there were a bunch of girls, 500 Indian girls. They said, and that's what the account says. It's an interesting thing. Well,
Yeah.
it's it's pretty clear that religion was important to the Calusa, but they had their own way of seeing the world, and they were not interested in becoming Catholics, which, of course, what the Spanish expected them to do. Uh, the Calusa had a belief in three souls. For example, it was um, there was a soul in a shadow, a soul in your reflection, and another soul in the pupil of the eye. And when you died, two of those souls went away, but the pupil in the eye lived forever. And so then they would go to their cemeteries and they would speak to their dead. And it was said that they got information on what was going to happen in the future and things that were happening other places at the same time from listening to the souls of the people who were buried there. So that's a belief that was written down by the Spaniards, but it sounds interesting. They
Yeah.
also had a trinity of deities, an overall creator of the universe. They had another deity who was a governor of society and politics, and then a third deity that was a war god that you could pray to in times of battle. And if that god favored you, then you would prevail. So it had a lot of emphasis on threes. Three souls, um, three deities. They had the mask processions that I mentioned. So there's a lot of richness, if you will. And it it did not occur to the Spaniards that these people who they regarded as simple and uh, primitive would not want to immediately adopt Catholicism. But the Calusa responded to them that these beliefs had served them well forever, for thousands of years in their way of thinking. Why would they want to change? So they
Mhm.
resisted missionization. They resisted Spanish attempts to convert them because their religion was very important to them.
Yeah, and then in the end, some did convert, correct?
Yes, some did. North
Yeah.
Florida, particularly.
When you think about jobs and what they had in their society, their predominant role was to fish. So it was correct. So it was kind of like,
Well, fishing was so important a part of their culture that I think a lot of tasks were probably oriented around fishing, whether it was the fishing itself or the maintenance of the fishing materials such as nets, or the cooking and processing of fish, the drying of things so that they would last. I mean, this is a subtropical area, right? So you don't just have a fish. You have to do something to it to if you're not going to eat it right away, then you have to dry it or smoke it or do something like that.
mm,
So there was a lot of tasks that must have been oriented around fishing, but they also they built things, they maintained things, they made tools, they used tools. There's a lot of different things that they did. And again, you have to imagine that if you need something, there's not a hardware store to go to or a lumber yard to go to. You have to obtain those things, make those things. If you want to need a boat, you don't go to the boat place and buy a boat. You make a dugout canoe out of a log. That takes a long time, and you have to have a tool to do that. What do you do? Well, you use a shell tool. How do you have a shell tool? We had to make the shell tool. So there are a lot of tasks that are not just about fishing itself, but about just life in general.
well, you said something about canoes, right? So they built canoes, right?
They
To
built canoes.
and then but so did other tribes nearby, no? Like their
Oh
own
yeah.
version?
Well,
Okay.
all coastal people and some interior people have canoes, and that's part of trade too. If you're going to go
Yeah.
some distance, you don't walk. You get in a boat and go.
Yeah.
You go up the coast, or you go through rivers. You go through a canal to get to a river. You go. Uh, you get to a place uh, uh, where you can't go any further. You stash that canoe and get another canoe and go further somewhere else. Transfers things over.
Yeah, because
Uh,
I don't know if they had like a difference in like the engineering of things, you know what I mean? Like the way they probably decorated those canoes or built them in between of other tribes nearby. Like there was differences in engineering, right? In the way they built things.
Yeah,
Um,
there's sometimes you can see differences in the boats. We don't have very many remnants of canoes. We know they have them, and the Spaniards talk about them. So they
yeah.
had barges, for example, that there was like one canoe on one side and one canoe on the other side, dugout canoes, and then a platform across the top. Can you
Oh wow.
imagine now? Now you got people on either side paddling the canoes, moving this barge that's at a flat top. There's one Spanish reference to the chief passing by, the king of the Calusa, passing by on a barge with feathers and things all decorated on this kingly barge. So they know what they were doing. They
Mhm.
they, they made boats. They used
Yeah.
boats.
So I was thinking about just how, today in society, like we have businesses and we build things. We have like logos and we have things that, that mark our business or our brand. So was there like a mark of Calusa that was kind of like their thing? Like I don't know if they like kind of like drew it on things that was just kind of like the Calusa mark or like something that really symbolized their society through like kind of like as if it was like modern day branding. You know what I mean?
That's a great question. I don't know. I would say that there are motifs in their art which appear to be inspired by living creatures, particularly cats, yeah, probably panthers. And so, but I don't. I can't think of an analogy that's like our branding or our logos.
Yeah.
It's the
I,
same. So that's not like that's the Calusa thing. Whenever you see that's Calusa. No, I can't see that. Again, they didn't decorate their pottery very much. Their their art is very realistic, and their the masks are painted in a very interesting way, and those have been analyzed too. One of my students did a master's thesis on the masks. Interesting stuff.
So we kind of went through, you mentioned something about how women were regarded in society, like just the different ways that they kind of um, did things, or just the structure. In a way, you went through structure. So I just kind of wanted to ask whether we had talked about like the whether the society was an egalitarian one, like no one left behind, everyone has like a job, food, shelter, safety, purpose.
I believe that over time, the Calusa changed from being a more egalitarian society to one that was more hierarchical. That is, when the Spaniards arrived, there was basically a governing class, an upper class, and then the commoners. So uh, a single family controlled the government and made decisions. So there
Yeah.
was a king, there was a war chief, and a medicine chief. And those three people were all from the same family, and those positions were inherited. And they had absolute power, absolute control over
Do you
their subjects.
do you know what activated that shift into more hierarchical, or?
I've speculated about it in some of my papers, but partly it had to do with a response to what was going on with the Tocobaga, who lived in the Tampa Bay area, today's Tampa Bay area. And they began to, after about 1000 AD, in a time of very good climate, everything was very good for everybody. Uh, the the people who were living in the greater Southeast, which we call the Mississippian culture, were uh, had trade relationships all the way down to Florida. The Tocobaga were taking advantage of that trade in ways that interfered with the Calusas trade. And there was a time when, during the Spanish occupation there, that the Tocobaga had hostages, had taken hostages of some of the royal family of the Calusa. So there was a lot of distrust and enmity between the Tocobaga and the Calusa. In situations like that, sometimes uh, societies need to organize themselves in ways where some people give orders and some people take orders. I say earlier on, they may have had more egalitarian relationships and depended more on other people in the interior for trade and for supplies. And at times when the climate was not as good as it was later, when there was a lot of challenges to finding fish, uh, uh, they depended on people in the interior for help. And the people in the interior, when things weren't going so well there, they depended on the people on the coast. And so it was uh, more balanced, if you will. Whereas later, when the Spaniards arrived, it seemed to be more hierarchical and kind of a top-down kind of government. So we don't understand all the subtleties of why that changed,
Yeah.
but it did go from being uh, more egalitarian to more hierarchical through time, and that started at around 1000 AD. And by the 14th century, in the 1300s, the Calusa had extended their influence throughout South Florida, so that by long before the Spaniards arrived, we believe they were drawing tribute from, uh, say, Lake Okeechobee, Miami, the Florida Keys, and those areas. So they they were already on that path of either responding to other people or doing it themselves, but one way or another, they became more hierarchical and more powerful, and were able
Yeah.
to dominate other groups in South Florida.
Yeah, I didn't realize how long they were there. That's a long time. Yeah, I didn't realize that. It
Yeah,
was
a lot longer than we've
wow.
been here. A lot longer than the U.S. has been
Yeah.
here.
Um, what conflicts did the Calusa have with other tribes in the Spanish that led them to their demise, and how do they deal with with these conflicts?
Well, there certainly was a strife and difficulties before the Spaniards arrived. But the Spaniards and other Europeans too brought in diseases to which the Calusa had no resistance. So a lot of there was a tremendous dying that happened early on in the 1500s and 1600s throughout the Southeast, in fact, throughout the country. And then on top of that, as the Spanish, the English, and then later the French began to trade, they were interested in finding furs and hides, and then later slaves, because their economy, the English, for example, their economy depended on having slave labor, and so they were there were Indian groups that were recruited by the English to enslave other Indian people. Uh,
Mhm.
and what would happen is that the Indian people would go into debt because the English would give them muskets and ammunition and clothing and cloth and liquor, and so they would go into debt. Then they owed the English a certain amount of hides or slaves or whatever to repay these debts, and so many Indian groups throughout the Southeast then became slavers, and many groups were enslaved, particularly after 1704. Uh, the line of Spanish missions and garrisons in North Florida kind of fell apart. At that point, armed Uchiza Creek and Yamasee people working for the English came into Florida and enslaved first the Appalachee people in North Florida, then the Timucuan people in Central Florida, and then the Calusa and their people. So literally thousands of people were enslaved, sold to the English and slaves in Charleston. Many of them went to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations, but there was just a constant need for more and more people as slaves. And so it is a combination. To say, well, what happened to the Calusa? Did they disappear? That's kind of a bad way of putting it, because they didn't just like disappear. They lost their populations due to diseases and militarism, and then finally slavery.
Yeah, and
So
then
by 1760, the last of the Calusa is said embarked from the Keys to go to Cuba, where most of them died anyway. But that's because they didn't have a resistance to diseases. So the Calusa are gone basically by the 18th century.
yeah, so where and how did they depart to reach Cuba, and who received them?
It was Spanish ships. The Spaniards felt that some of them had converted to Christianity, not very many, but that some of them ought to be saved, and that they had helped the Spaniards against the English at certain points. And so there was this, I guess you'd call it a humanitarian effort on the part of the Spanish to try to allow some of those people to come to Cuba. Uh, there was continuing pressure by the Creeks uh, attacking not only the Calusa people and their neighbors in South Florida, but also Spaniards themselves, Spanish Cubans. So it was a terrible time, and uh, Cuban fishing boats did go regularly back and forth from South Florida to Cuba. So the last, it is said anyway, that the last of the Calusa left in 1760 for bound for Cuba.
So there's a possibility that there's Calusa DNA mixed in.
There is, yes. There are records of some Calusa women who had children. Uh, uh, that's a whole other story, but a very few number of Calusa women were baptized, and their births are recorded in the church records in the Guanabacoa. And so, yes, there is Calusa DNA, blood, Calusa blood, whatever you want to call it, today. But there's no place you can go and listen to their language or study their culture. There are no places in Florida where they were from where you can go and talk to them. They disappeared as a culture, and even the people who went to Cuba, I'm sure they kind of got amalgamated into Cuban culture, and so
Yes.
basically the Calusa are out of the picture by the mid 1700s.
Yes, but also can live on through DNA, maybe.
I suppose you're right. Of course, you'd
Yeah.
have to find somebody who thought they were Calusa, and then try to figure all that out. I guess
That's
it could be
very
done. I don't know. I'm not a
that's
DNA expert.
that's so interesting because then it's like they weren't totally gone completely. There's probably some hope out there. They're in somebody somehow, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, one a Seminole Indian person, a good friend of mine, once said, I was saying something, well, how the Calusa are gone, and she said, if we're still talking about them, they're not really gone.
did we talk about the Calusa also having slaves? I don't think we did, right? Because we talked about them being enslaved, but we didn't talk about how they had slaves, right?
Yeah, the Calusa didn't have slaves in the sense that of ownership of another person. They did have captives. They had European captives sometimes, and they'd make them work, but they didn't have slaves as a class of people. They weren't they weren't a slave owning people. Uh,
Oh. Oh, I thought they took like people from other tribes, like and then captured them from other
well,
tribes.
yeah, there were hostages taken, and especially Europeans, especially Europeans who were shipwrecked along the southeast coast, uh, were brought to the Calusa, and one person was lived with him for 17 years, a guy named Fontaneda,
Oh
and
yeah.
he played a very important role because when Menendez came in 1566, he was able to act as a translator because he,
Mm.
of course, spoke Spanish when he was a child. And of course, he knew the Calusa language. So he was able to. One of the reasons we know so much, relatively speaking, about that time period in the 16th century is because of Fontaneda and what he wrote down. So, so it's not like they killed everybody. I guess it was he was a captive in a sense. They didn't let him go home to Spain. But on the other hand, he wasn't
Yeah.
really a slave in the sense that we think of slaves. Does
Yeah,
that make
because
sense?
yeah, because I don't know. I read like a research article, a research. Yeah, I think it was like a whole study, and I read that they had they would enslave other tribe members from other cultures, and I mean, sorry, from other indigenous groups nearby.
Yes, now that is true in the greater Southeast. There was a form of slavery in the greater Southeastern United States before the Spaniards arrived. There was a raiding that went on. One way that young warriors could gain status would be by capturing other people and bringing them back. Sometimes they tortured them, sometimes they killed them, and sometimes they made them work. And I guess you could call that slavery.
Okay.
Sometimes women were taken and married into the culture that captured them. And so they lived with them and became part of their tribe. So there was a kind of a form of slavery that existed before the Spaniards arrived and the Europeans generally, the English and the French.
Like among the tribes in South Florida.
But
Like,
in the tribes in South Florida, we just don't have any good information on that kind of
okay.
slavery. It may have existed, it just wasn't written down. And so
Mm, Oh, then I don't know.
I really don't know. You know, it's a question I can't give you a good answer to.
Yeah, then I don't know what I was reading then, because I was reading something. Maybe I didn't understand it, but okay,
Well,
okay.
there's some bad information out there too that you
Oh
know that
wow.
was a speculation that's not really based on any facts. So we try to base it on things that we know archaeologically or through documents that people.
Yeah, yeah. Why do you think the Calusa legacy is important to preserve, and um, does it correlate to the importance of preserving indigenous cultures around the world today?
Well, there's a lot to be learned from indigenous cultures throughout the world because they have survived over a long period of time through times of environmental change and other challenges. Uh, and they've taken advantage of opportunities because climate change does not always mean bad news. Sometimes it can be warmer. There's more water close to you. Maybe there's more fish. Uh, there's reasons why sometimes climate change can be a good thing, and then when climate change can be a bad thing. Like for the Calusa, if sea level falls even by a foot or two, they lived in very shallow estuary situations. Then certain fish go out in deeper waters, and you have to change your strategy. So so the environment provides challenges and it provides opportunities. Uh, as it changes, you have to be able to react to that one way or the other. Through archaeology and through history, we can learn more about uh, environmental changes, sea level fluctuations, storm surges, things like that that have happened in the past, can be revealed by archaeology and are written down in historical documents. So, learning more about indigenous cultures who live today and studying people like the Calusa, we can learn how the environment has changed in the past and how people uh, responded to it. But some of these cultures have lived literally for thousands of years, and they must have done something right.
Do you think societies around the world um, don't make a bigger effort to know their indigenous roots?
Well, I think that there are reasons why people don't pay attention to indigenous societies, and really they should. But I think probably there's a feeling among a lot of people that technology can solve all of our problems for us. And so there's a tendency to apply broad scale strategies and strategies that can diminish diversity in some cases to environments. And a lot of this is very well meaning, but it's based on modern science and it doesn't take into account the long term that has been successful in some of these areas for long periods of time. So I think the more that we can understand the subtleties of changes and how people have responded, the better we'll be able to apply changes in the future. So it's important to know about the past so that we can make better decisions today. Uh,
Yeah.
I think there's also one other thing, which is there's a tendency to imagine that um, that things are progressing, that things are as good today as they ever have been, and they're just going to get better somehow, and that people are smarter and more efficient today than they were before. But that's really not true. People have been as intelligent as we are today for probably 100,000 years at least. And, uh, you know, the idea that people can look at people that are remote from them in time or remote from them in space, like in some other continent or have some other religion uh, or, or lived in the past, they imagine that they just aren't as smart as we are and somehow don't know what we know. But that's not really true. There is indigenous knowledge that's irreplaceable. It has to be preserved, and people need to listen to it. And if they do that, I think we'll be better off. But it's I guess it's just a tendency of people that they just imagine that things couldn't get any better and they're just going to get better and better in the future. That's called the notion of progress.
Yeah, and I think this is starting to be a dialogue in the social media spaces. People are starting to say kind of what you said, which is good that we're doing this because then we can keep adding to that dialogue.
Well, add one more little stick to the fire.